Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history. Stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. Deep in the heart of Missouri's Ozark Mountains, where ancient limestone bluffs pierce through rolling hills like broken teeth, there exists a story that has haunted local communities for over a century and a half. It's a tale that begins in the bitter winter of 1868, when the dense forests seemed to whisper of something darker than the usual dangers that lurked in these remote wilderness areas. The Ozarks have always been a place where reality blurs with legend, where the mist that rises from hidden valleys carries more than just moisture from the springs below. These mountains have witnessed countless mysteries over the centuries, but few have proven as enduring or as deeply unsettling as what happened to the Caldwell brothers in that isolated homestead, miles from the nearest neighbor. Picture, if you will, the landscape as it existed in 1868. No electric lights pierced the darkness that fell like a heavy blanket over the endless expanse of oak, hickory, and pine. No roads connected these remote hollows to the outside world, only narrow paths worn by deer and the occasional trapper, brave enough to venture into territories where civilization had barely left its mark. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant call of a screech owl or the snap of a branch under the weight of some unseen creature moving through the underbrush. It was in this primordial setting that two brothers had chosen to make their home, far from the prying eyes and the judgmental whispers of proper society. Their cabin sat in a clearing carved from the virgin forest, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to lean inward, as if the very woods were watching, waiting for something to unfold. Local settlers who lived 20 miles away would later speak of an oppressive feeling that seemed to emanate from the direction of the Caldwell property. Travelers passing through the area reported an inexplicable sense of dread, a feeling that made them quicken their pace and glance nervously over their shoulders. Dogs would refuse to venture down the overgrown trail that led to their homestead, whimpering and backing away with their tails between their legs. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the sounds that began to emerge from that isolated hollow as winter tightened its grip on the Ozarks. Sounds that had no place in the natural order of things. Sounds that spoke of something fundamentally wrong taking root in that lonely place. Something that would ultimately consume not just the Caldwell brothers, but leave an indelible mark on the collective memory of everyone who would later hear their story. The wind that whistled through the bare branches seemed to carry with it the echo of voices, though no living soul could be seen. Shadows moved with purpose among the trees, always just at the edge of vision, always disappearing the moment someone tried to focus on them directly. And there was something else, something that the few witnesses would struggle to put into words for the rest of their lives. A presence that felt ancient and malevolent, as if the very land itself had awakened to some dark purpose. This is where our story truly begins, in that haunted hollow where two brothers would face a horror so profound that it would echo through the generations, leaving behind only questions, theories, and the kind of bone-deep terror that refuses to be forgotten. The Caldwell brothers, Jeremiah and Silas, were men shaped by hardship and forged in the crucible of frontier life. Jeremiah, the elder by 3 years, stood nearly 6 feet tall, with the kind of lean, weathered frame that spoke of a lifetime spent wresting a living from unforgiving land. His beard, prematurely streaked with gray despite his 32 years, framed a face marked by lines that seemed carved by worry as much as by the elements. Those who knew him described eyes that held a haunted quality, as if he'd seen things that no man should witness. Silas, at 29, possessed a different kind of intensity. Shorter and more compact than his brother, he moved with the fluid grace of someone perpetually ready for violence. His dark hair hung longer than was fashionable, often obscuring eyes that neighbors found difficult to meet directly. There was something predatory in his gaze, something that made even hardened frontiersmen uncomfortable in his presence. The brothers had arrived in the Missouri Ozarks 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1865, carrying little more than basic tools, a few precious books, and what appeared to be a substantial amount of cash. This last detail had not gone unnoticed by the locals, though the brothers offered no explanation for their apparent wealth, nor for what had driven them to seek such complete isolation in one of the most remote areas of an already sparsely populated region. What little was known of their past came in fragments, bits and pieces that emerged during their infrequent visits to the trading post at Cedar Creek, some 23 miles from their homestead. Jeremiah had once mentioned serving in the war, though he never specified which side, and the haunted look in his eyes suggested experiences that went far beyond the typical horrors of that conflict. Silas spoke even less of their history, but sharp-eyed observers noted the way his right hand bore scars consistent with knife wounds, and how he unconsciously checked the shadows whenever he entered a room. Their reasons for choosing such extreme isolation became a source of endless speculation among the scattered population of the region. Some whispered that they were deserters, hiding from military justice in the lawless expanse of the Ozarks. Others suggested they were outlaws, laying low until the heat from some unspecified crime had passed. The more imaginative locals spun tales of a family curse or a terrible secret that had driven them from civilized society to bury themselves in the wilderness. The truth, as is often the case with such mysteries, likely contained elements of all these theories, and none of them. What was certain was that the brothers had deliberately chosen a location that would minimize contact with the outside world. Their cabin sat at the end of a barely visible trail that wound through dense forest for over 5 miles before connecting to the nearest wagon road. Even reaching that road required knowledge of landmarks that the brothers were careful never to share with strangers. Their homestead itself reflected this desire for isolation and self-sufficiency. The main cabin, constructed from massive oak logs chinked with clay and moss, was built more like a fortress than a simple dwelling. The windows were small and positioned high, offering limited visibility from outside, while providing commanding views of all approaches to the property. A second, smaller structure served as both smokehouse and storage, while a third building housed the iron workshop where they crafted the tools and implements necessary for their isolated existence. But it was the relationship between the brothers themselves that would prove to be the most crucial element in the tragedy that was to unfold. From the beginning, their interactions were marked by an undercurrent of tension that seemed to go far deeper than simple sibling rivalry. Those few neighbors who had occasion to observe them together noted a complex dynamic that shifted constantly between fierce loyalty and barely contained hostility. Jeremiah, despite being the elder, often deferred to his younger brother in matters of practical decision-making, as if Silas possessed some knowledge or authority that transcended mere age. Yet there were moments when the older brother's demeanor would change completely, when some invisible line was crossed, and he would assert his dominance with a cold fury that left Silas visibly shaken. The brothers had established routines that seemed designed as much to avoid prolonged contact with each other as to accomplish necessary work. Jeremiah tended to their small herd of cattle and maintained the larger structures, while Silas focused on hunting, trapping, and the more delicate work of their mysterious other activities. They ate their meals in silence, slept in separate rooms despite the cabin's limited space, and often went days communicating only through necessity. This careful balance of shared isolation and mutual avoidance might have continued indefinitely, allowing the brothers to maintain their fragile coexistence in that remote hollow. But the Ozarks have always been a place where the natural world operates by its own rules, where the boundaries between the possible and impossible become blurred, and where the darkness that lurks in the human heart can find fertile ground in which to grow. Life in the Missouri Ozarks during the 1860s was a constant struggle against forces both seen and unseen. The region's rugged terrain and unpredictable climate created challenges that tested even the most experienced frontiersmen, while the isolation that the Caldwell brothers had sought for their own purposes brought with it a host of unexpected dangers. The winter of 1867 had been particularly harsh, with snowfall reaching depths not seen in living memory. The brothers had been forced to slaughter 2 of their cattle earlier than planned when their hay stores ran low, and by February they were rationing their remaining food supplies with the grim efficiency of men who understood that starvation was a very real possibility. But it wasn't just the physical hardships that began to take their toll on the isolated brothers. The profound silence of their hollow, broken only by the wind through the trees and the occasional cry of a wild animal, created an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to weigh on their minds with increasing intensity. Jeremiah began talking to himself during his daily chores, carrying on elaborate conversations with invisible companions, while Silas watched from the shadows with growing concern. For his part, Silas developed an obsession with watching the tree line that surrounded their clearing, convinced that he was being observed by someone or something that remained just beyond the range of vision. He would stand motionless for hours at a time, rifle in hand, scanning the dense forest for signs of movement that never materialized into anything concrete. His sleep became fitful and irregular, punctuated by sudden startles and whispered warnings to dangers that existed only in his increasingly paranoid imagination. It was during this period of mounting psychological pressure that the first truly inexplicable events began to occur around the Caldwell homestead. Tools that had been carefully stored in the workshop would be found scattered across the clearing in the morning, arranged in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic in their precision. Fence posts that had been firmly anchored would be discovered uprooted and moved to entirely different locations, despite the frozen ground that would have made such manual labor nearly impossible. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that began to emanate from the forest during the darkest hours of night. At first, these seemed like nothing more than the normal noises of nocturnal wildlife, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush, the distant howl of wolves, the crack of branches settling in the cold. But gradually, these sounds began to take on more unsettling characteristics. Footsteps could be heard circling the cabin, maintaining a steady rhythm that was far too regular to be attributed to any wild animal. The steps would begin just after midnight and continue for hours, always staying just beyond the range of the feeble light cast by the brothers' oil lamps. When Jeremiah or Silas would venture outside to investigate, armed with rifle and lantern, the sounds would immediately cease, leaving only an oppressive silence that felt heavy with unseen presence. On several occasions, both brothers reported hearing what sounded like whispered conversations coming from the direction of their livestock pen, though investigation revealed nothing but nervous cattle huddled together as if seeking protection from some perceived threat. The animals themselves began exhibiting increasingly strange behavior, refusing to graze in certain areas of their pasture and showing signs of stress that had no apparent cause. But perhaps most unnerving of all were the glimpses of movement that both brothers began to catch from the corners of their eyes. Shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the surrounding forest and move with purpose across the edges of their clearing, always disappearing the moment either man turned to look directly at them. These shadows, Appy, appeared to be roughly human in size and shape, but moved with a fluid quality that suggested something fundamentally different from normal human locomotion. The psychological toll of these unexplained phenomena was evident in the way the brothers' carefully maintained routines began to break down. Jeremiah started sleeping during daylight hours, claiming that the nights had become too dangerous for rest. Silas began setting elaborate trap systems around the perimeter of their property, though he could never adequately explain what he hoped to catch or how conventional snares might be effective against threats that seemed to exist partially outside the normal rules of physical reality. Their rare trips to the trading post at Cedar Creek became exercises in paranoid vigilance, with both brothers constantly checking over their shoulders and jumping at unexpected sounds. The few locals who encountered them during this period noted a dramatic change in their demeanor, describing them as men who appeared to be fleeing from something terrible, though they offered no explanation for their obvious distress. As winter began its slow retreat, and the first tentative signs of spring appeared in the Ozark forests, the brothers' situation continued to deteriorate. The strange occurrences around their homestead not only persisted, but seemed to be escalating in both frequency and intensity, as if whatever force was responsible was growing stronger or more confident in its activities. It was during this time that the first reports began to filter out to the surrounding communities, carried by trappers and occasional travelers who had ventured close enough to the Caldwell property to witness some of the inexplicable events for themselves. These accounts, while often dismissed as the products of overactive imaginations or too much corn whiskey, created a growing sense of unease among the scattered population of the region. Something was happening in that isolated hollow, something that defied rational explanation and seemed to be building toward some terrible climax. The question that haunted everyone who heard these stories was simple but chilling. What would happen when whatever was stalking the Caldwell brothers finally decided to reveal itself completely? The spring of 1868 brought with it a false sense of renewal to the Ozark Mountains, as if the natural world was attempting to mask the growing darkness that had taken root in the Caldwell brothers' hollow. Wildflowers bloomed in profusion along the forest paths. Birds returned from their southern migrations with songs that seemed almost desperate in their cheerfulness, and the streams that had been locked in ice began to flow again with the crystal clarity that gave the region its reputation for pristine beauty. But beneath this veneer of natural rebirth, something far more sinister was stirring. The unexplained phenomena that had plagued the brothers throughout the harsh winter months not only continued, but began to take on new and more disturbing characteristics. What had started as mere annoyances, displaced tools, strange sounds, fleeting shadows, was evolving into something that seemed designed to communicate a specific message, though the meaning remained frustratingly unclear. The first clear indication that they were dealing with something beyond mere atmospheric disturbances came on a particularly warm morning in early April. Jeremiah had risen before dawn to check on their cattle, following a routine he had maintained for months despite his growing paranoia. What he discovered in the pasture defied both logic and the laws of nature as he understood them. Every single fence post around the perimeter of their grazing area had been pulled from the ground and replanted in a perfect circle at the center of the field. The piozos, each weighing close to 50 pounds and buried 2 feet deep in hard clay soil, had been moved with surgical precision, their alignment so exact that it could only have been accomplished with surveying instruments. Yet there were no tracks in the soft earth, no signs of the heavy equipment that would have been necessary for such a task, and no indication of how it could have been accomplished in the few hours between Jeremiah's last inspection the previous evening and his discovery that morning. More disturbing still was the condition of the cattle themselves. The entire herd stood within the circle of fence posts, motionless as statues, their heads all turned toward the exact center of the formation. They remained in this position for the entire day, refusing food and water, unresponsive to any attempts to move them. When Silas tried to enter the circle to investigate, the animals became violently agitated, lowing in distress and backing away from him as if he represented some terrible threat. By evening, the cattle had gradually returned to normal behavior, but the fence posts remained in their impossible configuration, a stark reminder that the brothers were dealing with forces that operated far beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. Neither man spoke of what they had witnessed, but the shared experience seemed to deepen the psychological chasm that had been growing between them. As the days passed, other signs began to accumulate, each more unsettling than the last. Fresh graves appeared overnight in the small family cemetery that the brothers had established on a rise behind their cabin, though no bodies were ever discovered, and the rectangular depressions were always found empty by morning. The well that supplied their drinking water began producing liquid that, while appearing perfectly clear and normal, tasted of earth and decay no matter how many times it was drawn and tested. Most disturbing of all were the messages that began appearing carved into the bark of trees throughout their property. The symbols were unlike anything either brother had ever seen, resembling no known alphabet or written language, yet somehow conveying a sense of meaning that bypassed rational understanding and spoke directly to some deeper part of the human psyche. Jeremiah claimed the markings filled him with overwhelming dread, while Silas insisted they were actually warnings of some kind, though he could never explain how he had reached this conclusion. The isolation that had once provided the brothers with sanctuary from whatever they were fleeing now became a prison that magnified every fear and suspicion. With no outside perspective to provide balance or reassurance, their interpretations of events became increasingly extreme and mutually contradictory. Jeremiah became convinced that Silas was somehow responsible for the supernatural occurrences, perhaps through knowledge or abilities that he had kept hidden. Silas, meanwhile, developed an equally irrational belief that his brother had made some kind of pact with dark forces and was deliberately drawing malevolent attention to their homestead. These growing suspicions poisoned what little cooperation remained between them. Conversations became accusations, shared meals turned into exercises in mutual paranoia, and both brothers began taking precautions against each other that would have seemed absurd under normal circumstances. Jeremiah started locking his bedroom door at night and keeping a loaded pistol under his pillow. Silas began testing his food for poison and sleeping in the barn, claiming he no longer felt safe in the main cabin. Local residents, unaware of the full extent of what was happening at the Caldwell property, began to notice changes in the brothers' behavior during their increasingly rare appearances at the Cedar Creek trading post. Where once they had been merely antisocial and mysterious, they now appeared genuinely desperate, like men being hunted by something they couldn't escape or understand. The storekeeper, a pragmatic man named Thomas Hartwell, who had dealt with all manner of frontier eccentrics over the years, later described feeling genuinely frightened by the brothers' appearance during their final visit in late April. Both men had lost considerable weight. Their clothes hung loose on frames that seemed to have shrunk from some internal consumption. Their eyes darted constantly, never focusing on any one thing for more than a moment, and they jumped at every unexpected sound as if expecting attack from multiple directions. Most unnervingly, they had begun to communicate with each other in a kind of abbreviated code that suggested they were discussing threats and dangers that required constant vigilance. Their conversation was filled with references to them, it, and the signs, but neither would elaborate when asked directly about their concerns. Hartwell noted that they purchased unusual quantities of salt, iron nails, and lamp oil, items that had no apparent connection to normal homestead maintenance, but which suggested they were preparing for some kind of confrontation. As spring moved toward summer, reports began filtering in from travelers and hunters who had ventured near the Caldwell property. These accounts spoke of lights moving through the forest at night, following no pattern that could be attributed to human activity. The lights appeared as pale, flickering orbs that danced between the trees with an almost playful quality, except that they induced profound unease in anyone who observed them. One trapper, a man named Samuel Creek, who had spent 30 years in the wilderness and claimed to fear nothing that walked on 4 legs or 2, described watching these lights from a distance of perhaps half a mile. According to his account, the orbs seemed to be searching for something, methodically examining every tree, rock, and hidden hollow, as if following some predetermined pattern. When they reached the boundary of the Caldwell property, they would pause, hovering motionless for several minutes before retreating back into the deeper forest. Creek also reported hearing sounds that he initially mistook for human voices, though the words were in no language he recognized. The voices seemed to be engaged in heated discussion, possibly argument, though the tone was more alien than angry. When he attempted to get closer to investigate, the sounds ceased immediately, leaving only a silence so complete that even the normal night sounds of the forest were absent. These second-hand reports might have been dismissed as frontier folklore, except that they began to follow a consistent pattern that suggested genuine phenomena rather than mere imagination or fabrication. Multiple witnesses, reporting independently and often unaware of other accounts, described remarkably similar experiences. The dancing lights, the incomprehensible voices, the oppressive silence that followed any attempt at investigation. More importantly, these reports suggested that whatever was happening at the Caldwell homestead was beginning to spread beyond the boundaries of their property. The phenomena that had once been confined to their immediate vicinity now seemed to be extending outward, as if gaining strength or confidence. Local wildlife began avoiding the entire area, creating a zone of unnatural quiet that extended for miles in every direction. As summer approached its peak, the stage was set for whatever climax awaited in that haunted hollow. The Caldwell brothers, isolated and increasingly desperate, were clearly approaching some kind of breaking point, while the supernatural forces that had been stalking them seemed to be gathering strength for a final confrontation. The question that haunted everyone who knew of the situation was simple but terrifying. When that confrontation finally came, would there be anyone left to tell the tale? The summer of 1868 brought with it an oppressive heat that seemed to press down on the Missouri Ozarks like a physical weight. But nowhere was this sensation more intense than in the hollow where the Caldwell brothers had made their increasingly precarious home. The very air around their property seemed to thicken and stagnate, taking on an almost viscous quality that made breathing difficult and movement laborious. By July, the brothers had ceased all pretense of normal homestead activity. Their cattle wandered untended, gradually drifting away to join wild herds or falling prey to the wolves and bears that had grown bold in the absence of human intervention. Their garden, once carefully maintained, withered in neat rows that spoke of abandonment rather than drought. Even basic maintenance of their buildings and equipment had been neglected, as both men became consumed with what they perceived as the more immediate threat of supernatural persecution. The phenomena that had plagued them throughout the spring continued to escalate in both intensity and complexity. The mysterious symbols carved into trees throughout their property had multiplied exponentially, creating what appeared to be an elaborate communication system, or perhaps ritualistic preparation. Some trees bore dozens of markings, layered one over another in patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if the human eye was not equipped to process the information they contained. More disturbing still were the discoveries that the brothers began making in and around their cabin. Personal items that had been lost or misplaced years earlier would reappear in impossible locations. A pocket watch that Jeremiah had lost during the war was found buried precisely 6 feet deep in their vegetable garden, still keeping perfect time despite having been underground for months. Silas discovered a photograph of their deceased mother placed carefully on his pillow. Though the image had been altered in subtle but profoundly unsettling ways, the eyes seemed to track movement, and the familiar smile had been transformed into an expression of warning, or perhaps accusation. The brothers' psychological deterioration accelerated as these incidents multiplied. Jeremiah developed an obsession with documenting everything he observed, filling page after page with detailed descriptions of phenomena that seemed to grow more elaborate with each entry. His handwriting, once neat and legible, became increasingly erratic, sometimes trailing off mid-sentence as if he had been interrupted or distracted by something more pressing. Silas, meanwhile, began constructing what he called defensive preparations around their property, though the nature of these defenses suggested a mind grappling with threats that existed outside normal reality. He arranged complex patterns of iron nails and salt around the perimeter of their buildings, drew symbols of his own design on every door and window, and spent hours each day reciting what sounded like incantations in a mixture of English and words that belonged to no earthly language. It was during this period of mounting desperation that the brothers made their final trip to the Cedar Creek trading post, an expedition that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it as one of the most disturbing encounters of their lives. The date was July 18, 1868, and Thomas Hartwell's detailed account of that visit would later become crucial evidence in trying to understand what ultimately befell the Caldwell brothers. According to Hartwell's written statement, both men appeared to have aged decades in the few months since their previous visit. Their hair had gone completely gray, their faces were deeply lined with premature wrinkles, and they moved with the careful deliberation of men much older than their actual years. More unsettling still was their behavior, which suggested profound psychological trauma combined with an awareness of impending doom. Jeremiah spent the entire visit checking and rechecking the contents of his supply list, as if the specific combination of items he was purchasing might serve as protection against some unspecified threat. His purchases were bizarre: dozens of candles, 3 different types of salt, several pounds of iron filings, and a quantity of red ochre paint that he claimed was needed for marking the boundaries. When Hartwell asked what boundaries he was referring to, Jeremiah's response was rambling and incoherent, touching on themes of ancient contracts, inherited debts, and the need to satisfy the terms before the collection becomes final. Silas said almost nothing during the visit, but his behavior was equally disturbing. He remained constantly in motion, pacing the confines of the small store, while his eyes darted between the windows, as if expecting attack from multiple directions. Every few minutes, he would pause and cock his head to one side, listening intently to sounds that no one else could detect. When asked directly if he was hearing something, his only response was a whispered warning to keep your voice down. They might be listening. Most unnervingly, both brothers seemed to be communicating with invisible companions throughout their visit. They would pause mid-conversation to nod at empty air, sometimes appearing to listen to unheard voices before responding with cryptic comments about timing, preparation, and the need to complete the arrangement. When other customers tried to engage them in conversation, they would respond as if defending their actions to accusers that existed only in their own perception. Hartwell noted that the brothers made their purchases with coins that seemed far older than would be expected from men of their age and circumstances. The metal had an unusual coloration and weight, and several of the pieces bore markings that didn't correspond to any currency he recognized. When he mentioned this observation years later, numismatic experts would express fascination with his description, suggesting that the coins might have been Spanish colonial pieces from the previous century, though how the brothers might have acquired such artifacts remained a mystery. As they prepared to leave the trading post, Jeremiah made a statement that would haunt Hartwell for the rest of his life. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the afternoon sun, the older brother turned back and spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but carried clearly through the sudden silence that had fallen over the store. "If anyone comes asking about us," he said, "tell them the debt has been paid in full. Tell them the contract was honored according to the original terms. And tell them," here his voice broke slightly, "tell them we did our best to keep it contained to just the two of us." With those words, the Caldwell brothers walked out of the trading post and into history. They loaded their supplies onto their wagon with mechanical precision, ignoring the curious stares of other customers and bosses. Dee drove away down the dusty road that led back to their isolated hollow. Several witnesses noted that their departure was accompanied by an unusual stillness that seemed to settle over the entire community, as if their presence had been holding back some natural process that could now resume. That evening, multiple residents of Cedar Creek reported strange lights visible in the direction of the Caldwell property, though the distance was too great for any detailed observation. The lights appeared to be moving in complex patterns, sometimes rising high above the forest canopy, sometimes disappearing entirely, only to reappear in completely different locations. The display continued until well after midnight, when it ceased as abruptly as it had begun. In the days that followed, an unnatural quiet settled over the region. Wildlife that had been gradually avoiding the area around the Caldwell homestead now seemed to be fleeing the entire district. Hunting became impossible within a 20-mile radius, as if every creature capable of movement had received some primitive warning of impending danger. Even domestic animals began showing signs of extreme distress, refusing to venture outside and exhibiting behavior that their owners described as resembling terror. The few brave souls who attempted to travel the road that led toward the Caldwell property reported experiencing profound disorientation and an overwhelming compulsion to turn back. These episodes seemed to occur at roughly the same location, about 5 miles from the brothers' homestead, suggesting that some kind of barrier or warning system had been established around their territory. As July drew to a close and August began with unseasonably cool weather and an oppressive atmospheric pressure that seemed to affect everyone in the region, the stage was set for whatever final act awaited in that haunted hollow. The Caldwell brothers had essentially disappeared from the world of normal human contact, barricaded in their isolated cabin with whatever supernatural forces had been stalking them throughout the spring and summer. Local residents, while still unaware of the full extent of what was happening, sensed that some kind of climax was approaching. Conversations in the trading posts and meeting halls increasingly turned to the strange phenomena that had been reported throughout the region, and many families began making preparations to leave the area temporarily if conditions continued to deteriorate. What none of them realized was that the horror building in that remote hollow was about to reach its terrible conclusion, and that the events of the next few days would leave a mark on the collective memory of the Missouri Ozarks that would persist for generations to come. The night of August 3rd, 1868, would forever be remembered by those who experienced it as the night when the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds dissolved completely in the Missouri Ozarks. What began as an evening of typical summer thunderstorms would evolve into something so far beyond normal experience that many witnesses would spend the rest of their lives questioning their own sanity. The storm that rolled across the region that evening was unlike anything in living memory. Lightning struck with unprecedented frequency and intensity, but instead of the normal blue-white flash, many bolts appeared to burn with colors that had no names, deep purples that hurt to look at, greens that seemed to glow from within, and a particularly unsettling shade of red that left afterimages burned into the retinas of anyone unfortunate enough to witness it directly. The thunder that accompanied these otherworldly lightning strikes defied the normal laws of sound and distance. Instead of the expected rumble, that faded gradually across the landscape, these peals rang out with crystalline clarity, as if the very air had been transformed into a medium more capable of carrying sound waves than normal atmosphere. More disturbing still, the thunder seemed to contain elements that weren't quite random, patterns that suggested meaning, rhythms that almost resembled communication. But it was the reports from those hardy souls who were awake during the early hours of August 4th that would provide the most crucial evidence of what had transpired in the Caldwell brothers' hollow. Samuel Creek, the experienced trapper who had previously observed the mysterious lights near their property, was checking his trap lines when he witnessed an event that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. According to Creek's detailed testimony, recorded weeks later when he had recovered enough composure to speak coherently about his experience, he first became aware that something was wrong when every animal in the forest fell completely silent simultaneously. Not the gradual quieting that might accompany the approach of a large predator, but an instantaneous cessation of all sound that left the night feeling dead and hollow. From his position on a ridge, roughly 2 miles from the Caldwell homestead, Creek had a clear view down into their hollow, though the distance and darkness made detailed observation impossible under normal circumstances. What he saw that night, however, was anything but normal. The entire area around the brothers' cabin appeared to be glowing with a soft, phosphorescent light that seemed to emanate from the ground itself rather than from any external source. Within this area of supernatural illumination, figures could be seen moving with purpose and precision. Creek initially assumed these were the Caldwell brothers going about some late-night activity, but as he watched, through his spyglass, it became apparent that far more than 2 people were present in the clearing. He counted at least a dozen distinct forms, though their exact nature remained frustratingly unclear due to the strange quality of the light that seemed to blur details even as it made general shapes visible. Most unsettling of all was the apparent interaction between these figures and something that Creek could only describe as shapes that weren't quite there. These secondary presences seemed to exist at the very edge of perception, visible only when viewed peripherally, and vanishing entirely when observed directly. Yet their influence on the scene was unmistakable. The clearly visible figures appeared to be responding to directions or commands from these barely perceptible entities, moving in coordination with guidance that came from sources Creek couldn't quite see. The activity in the hollow continued for several hours, with the level of illumination waxing and waning in patterns that seemed too regular to be natural. At times, the light would flare so brightly that Creek was forced to shield his eyes, while at others it would dim to barely perceptible levels that left him wondering if he was observing anything at all or simply projecting meaning onto random phenomena. It was during one of these periods of intense illumination that Creek witnessed what he would later describe as the most terrifying moment of his life. For just an instant, the strange light that had been obscuring details seemed to clear, providing him with a crystal-clear view of the scene below. What he saw in that moment of perfect clarity defied both reason and the natural order of things. The figures moving around the Caldwell cabin were indeed human in general shape and size, but their movements were wrong in ways that Creek struggled to articulate. They seemed to glide rather than walk, their limbs bending at angles that suggested joints in places where no joints should exist. More distur. Bing still was their apparent interaction with objects and structures that weren't visible. They appeared to be manipulating invisible barriers, opening doors that couldn't be seen, and responding to architectural features that existed in some parallel version of reality. At the center of this supernatural tableau stood two figures that Creek recognized as the Caldwell brothers, though they appeared to have been transformed by their ordeal into something barely recognizable as human. Both men stood perfectly motionless, their arms raised above their heads in a gesture that suggested either supplication or surrender. Around them, the other figures moved in an elaborate pattern that resembled a ritualistic dance, though the purpose and meaning remained opaque. The entire scene was accompanied by sounds that Creek described as like voices, but not quite voices, a form of communication that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and speak directly to some deeper part of the human consciousness. These sounds carried emotional content that was unmistakably malevolent, filled with themes of satisfaction, completion, and the settling of ancient accounts. As dawn approached, the activity in the hollow began to subside. The supernatural illumination gradually faded, the mysterious figures became less distinct, and the oppressive silence that had dominated the night slowly gave way to the tentative return of normal forest sounds. By the time full daylight arrived, everything appeared to have returned to normal, leaving Creek to wonder if he had witnessed reality or suffered through the most vivid nightmare of his life. His uncertainty was resolved when he ventured down into the hollow later that morning, driven by a combination of curiosity and concern for the welfare of the Caldwell brothers. What he discovered there would provide the first concrete evidence that something truly extraordinary had occurred during the night. The brothers' cabin stood exactly as it always had, showing no signs of damage or disturbance. Their few possessions remained in place, their livestock were unharmed, and there were no obvious indicators of violence or struggle. Yet something fundamental had changed in ways that were immediately apparent to anyone who entered the space. The air inside the cabin felt different, thicker, more charged, as if it had been transformed by exposure to forces that operated according to different physical laws. Objects that had been familiar and mundane now seemed to carry an aura of significance that was both compelling and deeply unsettling. Even the quality of light that entered through the windows seemed altered, casting shadows that fell at impossible angles and created patterns of illumination that hurt to look at directly. Most significantly, there was no trace of the Caldwell brothers themselves. Their beds appeared to have been slept in recently. Their breakfast dishes remained on the table as if they had been interrupted mid-meal, and their personal belongings suggested they had been present just hours earlier. Yet they were gone as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only the lingering sense that their disappearance had been voluntary rather than the result of violence or abduction. Creek's discovery would mark the beginning of one of the most extensive search efforts in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. As word of the brothers' mysterious disappearance spread throughout the region and attracted attention from law enforcement, newspaper reporters, and curiosity seekers from hundreds of miles away. Yet despite the intensive investigation that followed, no trace of Jeremiah and Silas Caldwell would ever be found, and no satisfactory explanation for their vanishing would ever be proposed. The events of that terrible night had fundamentally altered the nature of reality in that isolated hollow, creating questions that would persist for generations and establishing the Caldwell brothers as central figures in one of America's most enduring supernatural mysteries. The discovery of the Caldwell brothers' empty homestead sent shockwaves through the scattered communities of the Missouri Ozarks that extended far beyond what might be expected from the simple disappearance of two reclusive settlers. The news spread with the supernatural speed that accompanies truly extraordinary events, carried by travelers, trappers, and traders who seemed compelled to share what they had heard with everyone they encountered. Samuel Creek, still shaken by his nighttime observations, initially hesitated to report his discoveries to the authorities. The rational part of his mind insisted that he must have misinterpreted what he had witnessed, that the strange lights and mysterious figures could be explained by atmospheric conditions, exhaustion, or simple imagination. But the evidence of his own senses, combined with the undeniable fact of the brothers' disappearance, finally compelled him to seek out Sheriff William Morrison in the county seat of Gainesville. Morrison, a practical man with over a decade of experience dealing with the various forms of violence and criminality that flourished in the lawless regions of the post-war frontier, initially approached the case with professional skepticism. Missing persons were unfortunately common in the sparsely populated territories, where individuals could disappear into the wilderness, never to be seen again, for reasons ranging from accident to foul play, to simple desire for a fresh start elsewhere. However, his attitude changed dramatically when he visited the Caldwell property personally and experienced the unsettling atmosphere that now pervaded the site. Morrison, who prided himself on his ability to remain objective and analytical under even the most disturbing circumstances, later admitted that he felt profound unease from the moment he entered the clearing around the cabin. The sheriff's official report, filed on August 8, 1868, provides a methodical inventory of what was found at the scene. But between the lines, a careful reader can detect the bewilderment of a man trying to apply rational investigation techniques to a situation that defied rational explanation. Every piece of evidence suggested that the brothers had been present just hours before the search began, yet they had vanished so completely that not even their most experienced trackers could find a single footprint leading away from the property. More disturbing still were the subtle changes that seemed to occur at the site while investigators were present. Tools and personal items would be found in different locations than they had been documented just hours earlier, despite the property being under constant surveillance. Temperatures would fluctuate dramatically within the confines of the cabin, sometimes dropping 20 degrees in the space of a few minutes before returning to normal without any apparent cause. Several members of the search party reported hearing voices coming from inside the cabin when it was known to be empty. Conversations that seemed to involve the missing brothers but were too muffled to make out clearly. When investigators would rush inside to locate the source of these sounds, they would find only silence and the increasingly oppressive atmosphere that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Word of these strange occurrences reached the offices of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, whose enterprising editor dispatched a reporter named Jonathan Whitmore to investigate what was being described as the most mysterious disappearance in Missouri history. Whitmore, a veteran journalist who had covered everything from political corruption to wartime atrocities, approached the assignment with the cynical confidence of a man who had seen enough human duplicity to doubt any story that couldn't be explained by ordinary greed, violence, or stupidity. His confidence evaporated within hours of arriving at the Caldwell homestead. Whitmore's subsequent articles, published in a series that ran throughout the month of August 1868, provide some of the most detailed contemporary accounts of the phenomena surrounding the brothers' disappearance. His writing, normally characterized by crisp professionalism and skeptical analysis, became increasingly emotional and disjointed as he struggled to describe experiences that challenged his fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. I came to this remote corner of Missouri expecting to debunk a simple case of frontier superstition, Whitmore wrote in his final article. Instead, I find myself questioning everything I thought I knew about the world we inhabit. Whatever happened to the Caldwell brothers, it was not the work of ordinary human agency, nor can it be explained by any natural phenomenon with which I am familiar. The journalist's presence attracted additional attention from curiosity seekers, amateur investigators, and what would later be recognized as some of America's first paranormal researchers. By late August, the Caldwell property had become something resembling a macabre tourist attraction, with visitors arriving daily to experience the strange atmosphere and search for clues that had eluded more systematic investigation. This influx of outsiders created tension with local residents, who found their previously peaceful communities overrun by strangers, asking probing questions about topics they preferred not to discuss. Many of the longtime settlers had their own theories about what had befallen the Caldwell brothers, theories rooted in generations of Ozark folklore that spoke of forces far older and more dangerous than anything recognized by modern civilization. These local perspectives, while dismissed by most of the visiting investigators as primitive superstition, actually provided crucial insights into the historical context surrounding the brothers' disappearance. According to tribal traditions preserved by the scattered Cherokee populations that still inhabited parts of the region, the hollow where the Caldwells had built their homestead was considered cursed ground, a place where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits had been permanently weakened by ancient tragedy. The Cherokee elders spoke of events that had occurred centuries earlier, before any European settlement of the region, when their ancestors had been forced to perform rituals of appeasement to prevent malevolent spirits from spreading beyond the confines of that particular valley. These rituals, according to tradition, had required periodic renewal by individuals who understood the proper ceremonies and possessed the spiritual authority to negotiate with the otherworldly forces involved. The implications of these native accounts were deeply troubling to anyone willing to consider them seriously. If the Cherokee traditions were accurate, then the Caldwell brothers had unknowingly built their homestead on ground that required constant spiritual maintenance to remain safe for human habitation. Their isolation and apparent lack of knowledge about the site's history would have left them completely unprepared for the supernatural forces that their presence had gradually awakened. More disturbing still was the suggestion that the brothers' disappearance might not represent the end of the supernatural activity, but rather its intensification. According to Cherokee belief, the failure to properly maintain the spiritual barriers around cursed ground would result in the gradual expansion of malevolent influence, potentially affecting the ever-widening areas until proper rituals could be performed to restore the balance. This perspective gained credibility as reports began filtering in from throughout the region of unusual phenomena that seemed to be spreading outward from the abandoned Caldwell homestead. Livestock deaths increased dramatically in a radius that appeared to be gradually expanding, always following the same pattern. Animals would be found dead without any signs of injury or disease, their bodies positioned in ways that suggested they had simply stopped living mid-activity. Travelers began reporting disorientation and unexplained fear when passing through certain areas that had previously been considered perfectly safe. Compasses would spin wildly in specific locations, maps would prove useless as familiar landmarks seemed to shift and change, and even experienced guides would find themselves hopelessly lost in terrain they had known since childhood. Most unnervingly, several individuals claimed to have encountered the Caldwell brothers themselves during these travels, though the nature of these encounters suggested that whatever the brothers had become bore little resemblance to their former selves. These figures appeared at the edge of vision, always disappearing when approached directly, but leaving behind an overwhelming sense of warning and desperate urgency. As summer turned to autumn, and the investigation into the brothers' disappearance continued to yield more questions than answers, it became clear that the events in that isolated hollow had fundamentally altered the supernatural landscape of the entire region. The comfortable boundary between the explicable and the mysterious had been permanently breached, leaving behind a legacy of fear and wonder that would persist for generations to come. The question that haunted everyone involved in the investigation was whether the Caldwell brothers had been victims of the supernatural forces that had stalked them, or whether they had somehow become part of those forces themselves, transformed by their ordeal into something that existed between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. As the first anniversary of the Caldwell brothers' disappearance approached, the Missouri Ozarks had been transformed from a remote but otherwise normal frontier region into something resembling a living laboratory for the study of supernatural phenomena. The abandoned homestead had become a pilgrimage site for investigators, curiosity seekers, and individuals who claimed to possess special sensitivity to otherworldly forces. Yet despite the intense scrutiny and countless theories proposed by both amateur and professional researchers, the mystery remained as impenetrable as ever. If anything, the accumulated evidence had only deepened the enigma, revealing layers of complexity that suggested the brothers' fate was connected to forces and histories far more ancient and extensive than anyone had initially suspected. The various theories that emerged to explain what had happened could be broadly categorized into several camps, each with passionate advocates and seemingly insurmountable objections. The rationalist interpretation insisted that the brothers had simply fled their homestead for reasons of their own, perhaps to escape debts or legal troubles, and that all the supernatural phenomena could be explained by a combination of mass hysteria, atmospheric anomalies, and the tendency of isolated communities to embellish unusual events into something far more dramatic than reality warranted. This explanation, while appealing to those who preferred their mysteries to have mundane solutions, failed to account for the physical evidence that continued to accumulate at the site. Experienced trackers who had spent their entire lives in the wilderness were unanimous in their conclusion that no human beings had left the Caldwell property on foot, horseback, or by any other conventional means. The brothers' personal possessions, including items of obvious sentimental and monetary value, remained exactly where they had been left, suggesting that any departure had been sudden and involuntary. A second theory proposed that the brothers had fallen victim to violence, possibly at the hands of criminals who had learned of their apparent wealth and isolated location. This explanation gained some credibility from the brothers' mysterious past and their possession of what appeared to be valuable coins of unusual origin. However, exhaustive searches of the surrounding area had failed to reveal any evidence of struggle, burial sites, or the kind of disturbance that would be expected from violent crime. More exotic theories drew upon the extensive folklore that surrounded the region, suggesting that the Caldwell brothers had encountered supernatural forces that operated according to rules and motivations beyond human understanding. These explanations varied widely in their specifics, ranging from encounters with malevolent spirits to abduction by creatures from other dimensions, but they shared a common acknowledgement that conventional investigation techniques were inadequate for understanding what had occurred. Perhaps the most disturbing theory was proposed by individuals who had spent considerable time studying the Cherokee accounts of the region's history. According to this interpretation, the Caldwell brothers had not been random victims of supernatural attack, but rather individuals who had been specifically chosen or drawn to the cursed hollow as part of some larger pattern or purpose. Their apparent wealth, mysterious background, and deliberate isolation all suggested that their presence at that particular location might not have been entirely coincidental. This theory gained support from the discovery of additional historical records that revealed the hollow had been the site of mysterious disappearances throughout the previous century. Spanish explorers, French traders, and early American settlers had all reported strange occurrences in the area, and several expeditions had vanished completely while investigating rumors of supernatural activity. The pattern suggested that whatever force was responsible had been operating for far longer than anyone had initially suspected. As investigators delved deeper into these historical precedents, an even more unsettling possibility emerged. Rather than being random victims, the Caldwell brothers might have been the latest in a long line of individuals who had been drawn to the hollow by supernatural influence. Their apparent free will in choosing such an isolated location, actually the result of manipulation by forces that required periodic human presence to maintain their power or continue their mysterious agenda. This interpretation cast the brothers' entire 3-year residence in the hollow in a completely different light. Their gradual psychological deterioration, the escalating supernatural phenomena, and their final mysterious disappearance might all have been stages in a predetermined process that had played out numerous times throughout history. The only variables would have been the specific individuals involved and the exact methods by which they were ultimately consumed by whatever lurked in that cursed valley. Support for this theory came from detailed analysis of the brothers' behavior during their final months, particularly their increasingly elaborate defensive preparations and their cryptic references to contracts, debts, and obligations that suggested they were aware of being trapped in a situation beyond their control. Their final statement at the Cedar Creek trading post about keeping it contained to just the two of them took on ominous new meaning when viewed as evidence that they understood their role as unwilling participants in some cosmic transaction. The implications of this interpretation were profoundly disturbing, suggesting that the supernatural forces responsible for the brothers' fate remained active and would eventually require new victims to continue their mysterious work. The gradual expansion of strange phenomena throughout the region might represent the early stages of a process designed to identify and influence potential new targets, individuals who would eventually find themselves drawn to investigate the mystery, or perhaps to settle in areas where the supernatural influence was strongest. As 1869 progressed, and reports of unusual occurrences continued to multiply throughout the Missouri Ozarks, it became clear that the Caldwell brothers' disappearance had been not an ending, but a beginning. Whatever forces had claimed them were far from satisfied, and the mystery that had consumed two isolated settlers was evolving into something with implications for the entire region. Local residents, initially curious about the strange events in their midst, began to exhibit signs of growing unease as the supernatural activity continued to expand. Property values plummeted in areas where unexplained phenomena had been reported. Families began relocating to distant communities, and even the most skeptical individuals started taking precautions against threats they couldn't name or understand, but somehow knew were real. The transformation of a simple missing persons case into a regional crisis demonstrated the power of genuine mystery to mentally alter human perception and behavior. The comfortable assumptions that allowed people to navigate daily life in a predictable world had been shattered by events that defied explanation, leaving behind a population that lived in constant awareness that reality was far stranger and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Today, more than 150 years after the Caldwell brothers vanished from their remote homestead in the Missouri Ozarks, their story continues to exert a powerful fascination over anyone who encounters it. The mystery has become deeply embedded in the folklore of the region, passed down through generations of families who treat it not as historical curiosity, but as a cautionary tale about forces that remain active and dangerous in the modern world. The physical site of the brothers' homestead has long since been reclaimed by the forest, though experienced guides can still locate the clearing where their cabin once stood. Visitors to the area report that the oppressive atmosphere noted by the original investigators persists to this day, creating an immediate sense of unease that seems to intensify the longer one remains in the vicinity. Modern scientific instruments have detected unusual electromagnetic readings and temperature fluctuations that have no apparent natural cause, while digital cameras and recording equipment frequently malfunction in ways that suggest some form of ongoing supernatural interference. The Hollow itself has become a destination for paranormal researchers who utilize increasingly sophisticated technology in attempts to understand what happened to the Caldwell brothers and why the effects of their disappearance continue to manifest more than a century later. These investigations have produced intriguing evidence of anomalous phenomena, including recordings of voices speaking in languages that linguistic experts cannot identify and photographs that seem to show figures moving through the abandoned clearing, despite the absence of any living persons at the time the images were captured. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports from individuals who claim to have encountered the Caldwell brothers themselves during visits to the site. These sightings follow a remarkably consistent pattern. Two male figures, dressed in clothing appropriate to the 1860s, observed at the edge of the tree line surrounding the clearing. The figures appear solid and real until approached directly, at which point they fade gradually from view, leaving behind only an overwhelming sense of sadness and urgent warning. These encounters have been reported by individuals with no prior knowledge of the brothers' story, suggesting that whatever supernatural process claimed Jeremiah and Silas Caldwell has preserved some aspect of their consciousness or identity in a form that can still interact with the living world. The emotional content of these encounters is universally described as desperate communication, as if the brothers are trying to convey vital information about their fate or warn others against making the same mistakes that led to their doom. The academic study of the Caldwell case has produced volumes of research by historians, anthropologists, and paranormal investigators. Yet the fundamental questions surrounding the brothers' disappearance remain unanswered. The Cherokee accounts of ancient curses and spiritual maintenance rituals have been extensively documented and verified against other tribal traditions, lending credibility to the theory that the brothers unknowingly settled on ground that required supernatural stewardship to remain safe for human habitation. Modern psychological analysis of the historical accounts suggests that the brothers' gradual mental deterioration followed patterns consistent with exposure to persistent psychological trauma, though the source of that trauma remains unexplained. Their increasing paranoia, social isolation, and elaborate defensive preparations all indicate individuals under extreme and prolonged stress. Yet there is no evidence of any conventional threat that could have produced such effects. The mystery has inspired countless books, documentaries, and fictional adaptations, each attempting to provide definitive answers to questions that may ultimately be unanswerable within the framework of conventional understanding. The story has become part of America's catalog of unsolved mysteries, joining other cases where the available evidence points toward explanations that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. What makes the Caldwell brothers' story particularly compelling is its suggestion that there are aspects of the natural world that operate according to rules and purposes that humans can neither understand nor control. The brothers' fate serves as a reminder that the comfortable boundaries of known reality are far more fragile than most people imagine, and that there are forces in the world that view human beings not as masters of their environment, but as resources to be utilized for purposes that remain forever beyond our comprehension. The hollow where Jeremiah and Silas Caldwell built their final home continues to exert its mysterious influence, drawing investigators and curiosity seekers who hope to solve a puzzle that has defied explanation for over a century. Each new attempt to understand what happened in that remote corner of the Missouri Ozarks adds to the accumulated evidence while somehow deepening the mystery, as if the very act of investigation serves to strengthen whatever supernatural forces were responsible for the brothers' fate. For those who venture into that haunted valley today, the experience serves as a profound reminder that there are questions in this world that may never be answered, mysteries that exist not to be solved, but to humble human arrogance and remind us of how little we truly understand about the universe we inhabit. The Caldwell brothers paid the ultimate price for this knowledge, and their story stands as an eternal warning that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire mystery is not what happened to Jeremiah and Silas Caldwell, but the growing evidence that their disappearance was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that continues to this day. The forces that claimed them remain active in that remote hollow, patient and eternal, waiting for the next unwary souls to venture too close to secrets that were never meant for human understanding. The macabre tale of the Caldwell brothers endures not because it provides answers, but because it poses questions that challenge our most basic assumptions about reality itself. Their fate serves as a gateway into realms of possibility that most people prefer not to contemplate, a reminder that the world contains depths of mystery and terror that no amount of scientific progress or rational analysis can fully illuminate. And somewhere in the Missouri Ozarks, in a clearing where two brothers once tried to build a life far from the complexities of civilization, that mystery continues to unfold, waiting for the next chapter in a story that may never truly end.